I did say that the three-point shot has been a little bit underappreciated. Now we see it all the time. James Harden is actually not too far behind Steph Curry. I mean, still an ocean's distance, but not the entire earth, if you will give me that. I believe he's passed Ray Allen, so he's second all time in threes. I bring you a very broad generalization question here. You can tear it down and take it any which way you want. Is James Harden starting to get underrated?
I think for sure. I wouldn't want to tear that down in any way. I think that James Harden is one of the greatest offensive players we've ever seen, maybe a little bit lackadaisical on defense, but he starts his career with the Thunder and it kind of plays like that six man, kind of an underrated, underappreciated role, but then goes to Houston and makes that his team where he's winning scoring titles. I don't know, like the Stephen A like famous clip where he like listed off the amount of games that he was going. It was like 36, 35, 34, 43, 50, like that clip. And then like he was doing that during a stretch of time where like in the NBA, I feel like now, like because of the three-point shot, averaging like high scoring totals is a little bit more normalized. But when he was doing it 2016, 2017, like he was still like he was the only if like one of two players averaging 30 plus, and he was doing it consistently. And he was taking the Warriors to like 7 games with Kevin Durant without Chris Paul. James Harden, I've never been like the biggest fan of him. And he has a lot of antics that come with him, but definitely I think he's a little bit underappreciated. And even what he's doing right now, he's towards the tail end of his career. And then he kept that Clippers team afloat. Like the only reason they are in that playoff play-in conversation is because of the fact when Kawhi inevitably got injured this season, he was the guy for that team. And obviously there was Norman Powell who stepped up, and that team has been just like it kind of stepped up in general without Kawhi, but James Harden had been the best player on that team towards when Kawhi was out. So I mean, even to this day, James Harden is a little bit underappreciated for what he's doing, and those runs where he pushed the Warriors to 7 games, I think nobody was really going to beat the Warriors, but the Rockets were the only ones who were going to even relatively come close, and they had a lot of great regular seasons. He won scoring titles. He has a bunch of all-star games. Like James Harden is, for my money, probably because I obviously I've only been alive for 19 years, probably the best offensive player I've ever seen.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said there. Also, James Harden definitely he didn't end up making the All-Star as like an alternate, did he this year? He was. I'd have to double check. I'm thinking about like also Norman Powell too. There was a
Yeah,
ton of different players that could have made it, but
I
he
think he
was
did.
yeah, okay. Well, he's been so good this year, and it's like one of those things where we don't appreciate James Harden because of all the things that he wasn't able to accomplish, and
Mhm.
not and it makes us lose sight of everything that he was able to do. You know, he has one MVP to his name. He could have like three, like
Yeah.
actually, or three or four. He was second like 3 times, I believe, for that MVP award. Now,
When
and
you
as time goes on, people want to give the 2018 MVP regular season award to LeBron James, and I get it. He had a great year that year, but if you remember, it wasn't like a conversation. Like it was James Harden. Then people reopened the conversation very quickly, like after like midway through the second round, right? When the Cavs were beating the Raptors. But I digress. Like his legacy is slowly but surely kind of getting torn down as time goes on. And he's going to end like however far behind Steph Curry, but a long ways ahead of Ray Allen. And
yeah.
that is something that is going to have to be talked about when we really start ranking shooting guards all time, because he's got a serious case. Now, the one thing that does hurt him is obviously, like you said, you mentioned in the positive light, the series against the Warriors where they took it to 7 games, just like the meltdown, the Chris Paul injury, kind of just taking the wind out of their sails. They were, I believe, up at halftime in game 7 without Chris Paul, right? Like after Chris Paul went down in game 6,
Mhm.
or if I'm remembering that correctly, or maybe he went down in game 5, but like they were up at one point at halftime and in a closeout game of that series, and they just weren't able to take it home and miss like what 27 straight threes or something like that. That's always going to bug Harden. I know it probably like in that Rockets team, but just unbelievable that he took that team to 7 games and it was competitive even when Chris Paul went down. And over time, I think he's one of those players that's going to get a little lost. And I think James Harden is much better than like Paul Pierce, like just certainly more talented.
Mhm.
But I see it with players like Paul Pierce, and even I feel like Dwayne Wade is one of those players that's kind of getting a little lost in the shuffle too when we have these conversations. But at the same in the same moment that a top 10 conversation might be a little difficult to have, there's just so many players. But I definitely think James Harden's going to get lost a little bit as time goes on.
Yeah, just anytime you're able to win 3 straight years as a scoring champion, you know that you're doing something correct. 2018 through 2020, he was kind of just like blowing the doors off the league, averaging like it felt like he putting up 30 points. It felt like every single night. He 6 all NBA first teams. Like just there's a list of accomplishments. Obviously, he doesn't have that ring, and that'll probably be a knock on his career too. When you talk about just like career accolades, the fact that he was never able to get one, at least for as of this moment, and probably won't ever get one. But I mean, just for my buck, James Harden is one of the greatest scorers I've ever seen.
Last point here on this, and then we'll move to the NFL draft. But James Harden, if he were to actually get a ring by the end of his career, I think that would kind of help his legacy a lot to just not be forgotten. Not that it would just prove to us that he was like a winner or that he could contribute to winning basketball. I think at a certain point, you have to give that up and say he can. The system with the Rockets maybe wasn't built to win 16 games in the postseason. It wasn't James Harden's fault, right? Like he certainly had his moments where he didn't come up where he needed to in the playoffs. But when you think of Rockets basketball in the 2010s, you think of James Harden, and that's really, really good stuff. And maybe he didn't win a championship, but if he gets one on the way out, maybe it's not so bad for his legacy, right? And it actually kind of adds to it. He's a part of a team. It just sucks that he's on the Clippers having these really good years still as somebody who's now older, right? Because it means nothing. So
Yeah.